very much.
Join me in welcoming.
Thank you very much, Sasha. You know, it's nice to have friends. They sort of flatter you. What I want, is this going to be a problem? I'm moving around because I can't stand still. Okay. What I want to do today is I want to introduce you to the topic of evolution in the doctrine and the thinking of Muslim fundamentalist movements. And the movement that I'm going to be focusing on today is the Gama'ah Islamiyah. The Gama'ah Islamiyah. Now, the Gama'ah Islamiyah, of course, is an Egyptian movement. The G here is reflective of the Egyptian dialect of Arabic. For others, it would be Jama'ah Islamiyah. This is, in fact, the largest of a crop of young, violent jihadist movements that emerged out of Sadat's Egypt in the 1970s. The Gama'ah Islamiyah has produced a number of very important figures, and its members have been involved in jihadist movements globally. This is an extremely important movement. But before we get started, I want to make it clear that this is the Gama'ah Islamiyah out of Egypt. There are other movements that go under the name Jama'ah Islamiyah. For example, there's one in Indonesia that is a separate and distinct movement. What we're going to be talking about today is the Gama'ah Islamiyah. We're going to be talking about how the Gama'ah begins as an organization dedicated to the mission of establishing an Islamic state, and doing so by any means necessary, including violence. They start out in the late 1970s, and they reach their sort of apogee of activity in 1981. To give you a real sense of what these guys were about and the degree to which they meant business, I have a short clip that I want to show you from which I hope that you will gain a sense of what was going on in the late 70s and early 1980s. All right? This clip is going to include segments from the assassination of President Anwar Sadat of Egypt. All right? Now, just to set it up for you, the Gama'ah Islamiyah was the larger of an amalgamation of groups that came together and decided during the late 70s, 1980 or so, they coalesced and decided that they were going to assassinate Sadat, take over the Egyptian state, and establish an Islamic state. All right? The Gama'ah was joined by another movement known as Tanzim al-Jihad. Tanzim al-Jihad, the jihad organization. The Gama'ah actually was based in Upper Egypt, that is the south of Egypt. Tanzim al-Jihad was based in Cairo, the capital. There are two important figures that we should know about. One is Muhammad Abdussalam Farag. Faraj or Farag. The other is Karam Muhammad Zuhdi. Now, Muhammad Abdussalam Farag was the leader of the Cairene wing of this coalition. In the late 1970s, he had written a book called The Hidden Duty. And in this book, he condemned the Egyptian state as an apostate regime. Why? Because the Egyptian state did not apply Islamic law, and it did not rule in accordance with the dictates of the Quran and the teachings of the Prophet. Moreover, the Egyptian state was at this time steeped in repression of Islamic movements. So what Muhammad Abdul Salam Farag did is he wrote a book entitled The Hidden Duty, in which he basically condemned the Egyptian state as an apostate regime, not Egyptian society as a whole, and called upon Muslims to undertake their duty to overthrow this state. Karam Muhammad Zuhdi was actually a co-founder and leader of the Gama'ah Islamiyah. It is these two groups together that come together and plan the assassination of Anwar Sadat. What we're going to see is the Kareen wing in action now during the assassination of President Anwar Sadat. Anyone who knows me knows that I'm sort of a Neanderthal when it comes to all this technology stuff, so I'm hoping that this stuff is going to work. Let's see. Well. Oh, I see. You have to get in the center there? Yeah. Okay. Right there. Right there. All right, well, this is not. Well, this is, he went back a little further. What they're, it's not, can you hear that? I can't even hear it. So we're not going to have any sound. All right, what's going on here is that they're showing how many of the Islamicists are being arrested during the time of Anwar Sadat. This is the actual parade of Anwar Sadat on October 6th, 1981. Now you're about to see what's going to happen. This is the parade. That's Sadat, of course. There it is. You can't hear that at all, can you? Can we turn it up? Well, what they're showing here is once Sadat is assassinated, the Islamicists are rounded up. That's an Egyptian prison. This guy right here, who you're about to see, you should know him. He's the author of the handout that you were given to read. His name is Muntasir Zayat. He's a lawyer. He was also arrested in a general roundup after the assassination of Sadat. All right? Since we can't hear, he's talking about here the kind of torture and treatment that they received in prison. All right? He was a cellmate part of the time and a cell neighbor of Ayman al-Zawahiri. Zawahiri was involved in the Cairo wing, the Tanzim al-Jihad. Zawahiri, however, was not involved in the actual assassination of Sadat. He was rounded up on a charge of possession of a firearm and given time. Can you hear it now? That's the Wahidi there. It's only the front guys who can. All right, this is actually the trial. I'm going to, well, not the trial, one of the hearings. I'm going to stop it after this. But I just want to give you a sense of what's going on here. Ayman al-Zawahiri is going to be speaking here, and there's a reason for that. That's Zawahiri there. All right, I think we can stop it there. How do we stop this? Center and hit it. If this mouse will work. Okay. All right. Okay. Now, what we're going to see here, what we're seeing here is a conflagration of very important figures who were involved in the early Islamicist movements in Egypt. Egypt was a major ground for the development of violent Islamic movements. The assassination of a Sadat is, in a sense, a pinnacle of violent operations of the Islamic movements in Egypt. Once Sadat is assassinated, they are arrested in a grand roundup of Islamicists. They're taken to prison and they are tortured. Ayman al-Zawahiri is among those. Meanwhile, the Gama'ah Islamiyah, which is actually the bigger wing, they were involved in a parallel operation in the city of Asyut. Asyut, yeah, we can get rid of that. Asyut is in the southern part of Egypt. The plan was that the Tanzim would take care of Sadat in Cairo, while the Gama'ah would take over the city of Asyut, and then they would march on northward, picking up cities on the way for a grand crescendo in Cairo, where they would reunite with Muhammad Abdus-Salam Farag's group and complete their takeover of the government. That plan also failed, and Karam Muhammad Zuhdi, the leader, and many other individuals were arrested. All right? So now we have the Tanzim al-Jihad under arrest. We have the Gama'ah under arrest. They are now all in prison. Now, Ayman al-Zawahiri, who has come into prominence because of his involvement with Al-Qaeda, sort of is given a prominent place in all of these narratives. In point of fact, however, he was not as prominent a figure in these movements. And part of what, in a sense, diminishes his standing is that he spent 3 years in prison, and he was viciously tortured, as a result of which he broke down, and he turned state's evidence. All right? The Gama'ah members, on the other hand, were imprisoned, and a number of them at the time that they were in prison, they were actually shot, because some of them got shot in the process of the Asyut mission. They go to prison, and altogether, they end up doing more than 2 decades in prison. All right? Now, the Gama'ah, without turning any kinds of state's evidence. These are hardcore Islamists. And by the way, most of them are your age. All right? They're in their early 20s. And these are not poor, uneducated, downtrodden, marginal people in society. These are engineers. These are pharmacy students. These are medical students. Some of them are even practicing doctors. All right? And the Egyptian university campuses are a primary breeding ground for them. Okay? Now, the Gama'ah Islamiyah has what is known as a consultative council. It is a very highly organized movement. And the consultative council coordinates all of the activities of the Gama'ah Islamiyah. Karam Zuhdi is the head of the Consultative Council. After the assassination of Sadat, Muhammad Abdussalam Farag is executed. He's executed for the assassination of Sadat, along with another name that you should probably know, a man by the name of Khalid al-Islambuli. Islambuli was actually the man who you saw getting out of the lorry, getting out of the truck, taking that first shot. He's the man who is actually credited, I don't know how we should say that, with the actual assassination of Sadat. Well, these guys are executed. And what happens is that the coalition between Tanzim al-Jihad and the Gama'ah Islamiyah falls apart in prison. And the Gama'ah Islamiyah resumes its status as an autonomous organization. All right? Now, its leadership, the majority of its leadership, is still in prison. But the Gama'ah continues its activities because it has cells all over Egypt. And it coordinates its missions, all right, through a highly sophisticated network of leaders and followers. Throughout the 80s and 90s, the Gama'ah Islamiyah continues its attacks on the Egyptian government to the tune of something above 1,000 deaths. They are raining down murder on everyone, and no one is spared. Western tourists are killed. Egyptian intellectuals are killed. Coptic Christians are killed. Security forces are killed. The Speaker of the Egyptian Parliament is even assassinated. They make an attempt on the Nobel laureate, Najib Mahfouz. They make an attempt on President Hosni Mubarak. And this is particularly interesting because the attempt on Hosni Mubarak actually takes place outside of Cairo. Hosni Mubarak was on an official state visit to Addis Ababa. And the Gama'ah coordinated an attempt to assassinate Hosni Mubarak. Now, the point to be noted here is that the Gama'ah has international tentacles, all right? And the incarcerated leadership is coordinating all of these activities from within prison, all right? The Gama'ah is the largest, most notorious, and most vicious of these young jihadi Egyptian movements at the time. The assassination of Anwar Sadat takes place in 1981, on October 6, 1981. From that time all the way up to 1997, the Gama'ah, as I said, continues to rain down murderous mayhem on Egyptian society. By this time, however, between 1981 and 1997, a full 16 years has passed. And the young Gama'ah members who were in their 20s at the time that they decided to assassinate Sadat, all right, many of them are approaching or already in their 40s, all right? And this is what takes us to the next real important event in the evolution of the Gama'ah Islamiyah. On July 5th, 1997, there was a trial of one of the Gama'ah members. He was charged with blowing up banks. He was brought before a military tribunal. At this hearing, he stood up in open court and read a declaration signed by 6 of the Gama'ah's traditional consultative council members. This statement said that the Gama'ah Islamiyah now renounces political violence, that it would no longer order, coordinate, encourage, or condone any political violence for the purpose of trying to bring about an Islamic state. It renounced violence as a part of its program. All right? Now, this, of course, shocked the nation. All right? Because, as I said, the Gama'ah was the largest, most notorious. All right? And whereas, as I said, and I'm not picking on Zawahiri here, I'm just trying to give you a sense of the levels of commitment of this group. Whereas Zawahiri had basically turned in about 3 years, and Zawahiri was released. All right? These guys were still in prison. All right? Dealing with all the stuff that Muntada Zayat had talked about. All right? In prison, however, what happened is that they gained exposure and access to traditional religious education. Within the prison system, they were granted access to books. They were granted access to religious teachers, both from the outside and the inside. As a result of which, they began to study. They began to study the Quran, to study the teachings of the Prophet, to study Islamic law, to study theology, to study legal theory, to study how Islam is interpreted on the ground. And they came to the conclusion that their understanding of jihad and the manner of going about establishing an Islamic order was wrong. And therefore, on July 5th, 1997, they decided to issue this declaration. This was the formal inauguration of what came to be known as the Initiative to Stop the Violence. The Initiative to Stop the Violence. It was announced, as I said, July 5th, 1997. Now, the initial reaction to this initiative to stop the violence was mixed. Of course, the Egyptian authorities did not fully buy it. But even more importantly, within the Gama'ah itself, there was massive disagreement, and there were even some defections. People who decided that we will not go along with this initiative to stop the violence, and therefore we will leave the Gama'ah. All right? Some of these people left the Gama'ah. For example, Rifa'i Taha, who was one of the old guard Gama'ah leaders, he decided, I'm not going along with this. He left, went to Afghanistan, joined Osama bin Laden, and in 1998 was one of the signatories of the famous fatwa of Osama bin Laden, in which he called upon Muslims to do what? To kill Americans anywhere you find them. All right? Because America was part of the problem. The bulk, however, of the Gama'ah went along with the initiative. All right? But they went along with the initiative for the following reason. By this time, you got to look from 1981 to 1997, the Gama'ah had continued to grow. And it had now come to include a new generation, so to speak, of first and second tier leaders as well as rank and file. All right? But its main leadership was still incarcerated. Karam Muhammad Zuhdi, all right, and the 8 other members of the Consultative Council, they were all still in prison. They are the people who came up with the idea of the initiative to stop the violence. And in order to add to their credibility, to give them greater authority to be able to do that, they began to refer to themselves as the historical leadership of the Gama'ah Islamiyah. Right? In other words, we are the people who paid the dues. All right? If the Gama'ah is anything, it is what it is because of whom? Because of us. We are the historical leadership of the Gama'ah. All right? And so they capitalized on the prestige that came from their historical role in order to promote this initiative to stop the violence. Now, there were a number of setbacks because, as I said, the Egyptian government was not very, how should I put it, convinced that these guys were serious. Many of them thought that this was just a cheap ploy for either sentence commutations or sentence reductions. In other words, they're just trying to get out of jail. All right? In another part of the book that you had the excerpt from, I don't know if it's in there. Yeah. Muntasir Zayyat makes the point that this is not likely the case, because Gama'ah leaders have never bowed for any kinds of concessions. And not only that, even if they wanted to bow for concessions, they had come to understand something when they were in prison. The Egyptian authorities had routinely made deals with Islamist movements and routinely gone back on their deals. All right? And so the Gama'ah understood that even if we offer this for sentence reductions or sentence commutations, we're not likely to get them. All right? This was, therefore, a principled commitment based on arguments that I'll get into a little bit ahead of this. Now, probably the biggest setback came in November of 1997. Again, the initiative was announced when? July 5th, 1997. On November 17th, there was a massacre of some 58 Western tourists, along with a number of Egyptians, at the temple of Hatshepsut in Luxor. That's, again, the southern part of Egypt. All right? This was carried out by a wing of the Gama'ah Islamiyah. This is after the announcement. This is November. This is after the announcement of the initiative. All right? They came out of the mountains, descended on the temple, and killed 58 Western tourists, along with a number of Egyptians. Slaughtered them. All right? Now, Qaram Muhammad Zuhdi would later refer to this as a huge stab in our backs, all right? Because the Egyptian government had cast aspersions on the sincerity of the Gama'ah in announcing this initiative, all right? The Luxor massacre simply confirmed the Egyptian government in its suspicions about the Gama'ah's sincerity. Qaram Zuhdi would later explain that, look, we were in prison, all right? And sometimes communications between us, those of us on the inside, and second-tier leadership on the outside, either got jammed up or they didn't get our word. Our words did not reach them, all right? So he explained this in terms of the Gama'ah wing in the mountains. And by this time, Gama'ah wings, all of the Gama'ah members, I mean, they're basically in hiding. Even if they're not imprisoned, right? They're not just prancing around the streets, you know, hey, I'm a Gama'ah member, all right? They have to be very careful about how they move around in society. So he says they didn't get that message, all right? And what he does is he insists, no, the initiative is real, and we're going to continue it. And the historical leadership continues to press for this initiative to stop the violence. All right? Now, this reaches another stage in 2002. There are a number of stages here, but in 2002, something else happens. In fact, it's around November or December 2000. No, it's 2001. Yeah, 2001. My mistake. November, December 2001. Something else happens. And we have to see this in a global context now. What happens in September of 2001? 9/11 happens. Between 1997 and 2001, the historical leadership of the Gama'ah continues to try and press for this initiative to stop the violence. All right? They continue to campaign within prison, all right, and outside of prison. All right? A major figure in this regard, I shouldn't say major, he's a figure, is this person. Anybody know who he is? Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman, the blind sheikh who was charged in the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman had actually functioned as a spiritual guide and a teacher for the Gama'ah. He, however, at this time was incarcerated in the States. All right? But there is communication between him and the Gama'ah. And around 2000, between 1999 and 2000, Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman essentially sends a message condoning the initiatives to stop the violence. He said, this is something that you should do. He goes back and forth, all right? But ultimately, he gives the green light to Gama'ah leadership. And this is not so important for Gama'ah leadership within prison because they've already decided that this is what they're going to do, all right? But this is a confirmation for the rank and file, all right? By the way, you may have heard about the trial of the American attorney, Lynn Stewart. No? She's an American attorney. She was the attorney for Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman, and she was arrested and indicted for passing communications between Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman and the Gama'ah. All right? And it's in fact from transcripts of her indictment that we find out some of what's going on in the Gama'ah because they're talking about it in these communications. Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman, however, ultimately comes around to endorsing the initiative to stop the violence. All right? That's followed in 2001 by September 11th. In the aftermath of September 11th, the Egyptian government begins to soften its stand on the initiative. So they decide to allow Gama'ah leadership to undertake a roving or roaming mission around to prisons in Egypt, all right, to debate the initiative and to try to convince incarcerated rank-and-file Gama'ah members of the propriety of the initiative, all right? And so for about 10 months, the Egyptian government permits the Gama'ah leadership to travel around to various prisons inside of Egypt to debate, discuss, and hopefully ratify the initiative to stop the violence. All right? And I think it's rather clear that the fallout of 9/11 was a major incentive, all right, prompting the Egyptian government to, in a sense, certainly, if not actively support it, then certainly to cease to cast aspersions on it because they came to see it as something that could be potentially useful. All of this culminates in January of 2002 with what I take to be perhaps the crowning gesture on the part of the Gama'ah. In January 2002, the historical leadership issues a series of books, 4 small booklets under the series title, Correcting Understandings. These books are joint publications. And the way it would go is that one or two members of the incarcerated consultative council would write one of these books. The rest of the consultative council would then debate the content of these books. All right? Once they reached a general agreement among themselves, the books then were sent to Al-Azhar. I don't know if you've heard of that. Al-Azhar? All right? Well, they were sent to Al-Azhar for official endorsement and critique. They were sent to Al-Azhar, however, anonymously, with no names attached. Al-Azhar's Council of Islamic Research issued reports on all 4 books, in which they basically said that we suggest this cosmetic change or that cosmetic emphasis. All right? But the bottom line is that there is nothing in these books that contravene the teachings of Islam. So these books are sound from the perspective of Islamic law and doctrine. All right? Now, what were the titles of these books and what did they deal with? There were 4 titles. The first is Initiative to Stop the Violence, a Realistic Vision and a Sharia Perspective. That's 1. 2, shedding light on the mistakes that have befallen the understanding of jihad. Shedding light on the mistakes that have befallen the understanding of jihad. 3, advice and clarification to correct misunderstandings among those who police public morals. And 4, the impermissibility of religious extremism and of declaring fellow Muslims to be infidels. All right? Now, these are the 4 booklets that were issued by the Gama'ah in January of 2002, and they bear the signatures of all 8 consultative council members. So these are official declarations of the Gama'ah. And in these books, what the Gama'ah declares is that we had a faulty understanding of Islam, and we are now writing these books as a means of correcting our understanding and correcting the understandings of other Islamists who may be out there. All right? Now, this is really important because even Gil Capel and others, they tend to refer to the initiative to stop the violence as a ceasefire. They refer to it as a ceasefire. It was not a ceasefire. It entailed a ceasefire. But it was not a simple ceasefire. The initiative to stop the violence was a public review of Gama'ah doctrine and a public declaration of correcting the view that the Gama'ah Islamiyah had held up to that time. In other words, this was not a tactical move, it was a doctrinal shift. All right? And in these books, basically, they declare that jihad against the Egyptian government is not permissible according to Islamic law. Now, how did they come to this argument? Well, the first thing that they do is they argue, again, on the basis of traditional ideas that we know from classical Islamic law. How much should I load them down with technical terms? I'll give you this one. You can, good. You can zing somebody at a cocktail party or something like that. All right? The classical notion of maslahah. Now, this notion says that Islamic law is not simply the individual dictates of the law, but that those individual dictates are intended to serve broader aims and purposes of the law. All right? Okay?